Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are honored to be sitting down with Jayant Bhandari, a writer and an advisor of institutional investors. Jayant, we've had a discussion in the past for the GSB podcast, and we covered a wide range of cultural topics, which I think we'll get into some today as well. I wanted to start, however, with the gold market currently and how that looks, not only maybe from a financial perspective, but also from a business perspective. How is the industry doing in North America, or any other thoughts that cross your mind?
Well, there has been, Justin, a huge amount of pessimism involved in the industry because of all this confusion to do with the monetary policies of governments around the world and the expectation of growth that people have around the world. Gold price has been stuck between $750 US dollar and $1,800 US dollar for the last several months, which tells me that gold price is actually very sticky. It falls by about $50 if the market is very pessimistic, and then it reverts back to $1,800 level very quickly. My view is that we live in an extraordinarily uncertain times. The kind of corruption, lack of meritocracy, the stupidity of experts who rule our lives is so much that we are actually consuming our capital. We are destroying the economies around the world, except I think in East Asia. And that means that a lot of people should have some solid moors. They should have solid anchors in their lives. They should have a part of their wealth in forms that could be converted into cash for their personal consumption whenever they want, easily. And gold is one of those ways to preserve some of your consumption capabilities in going forward. I think we are heading towards a massive problem in the future. Look at what's happening in the US. The government, the president might be imposing a requirement on banks to provide all information about your bank accounts to the government. Now, earlier, and people tend to forget that, cash was basically removed from the monetary circus. And now what you have is that everything, all your cash is in electronic form. Now, if they impose restrictions on it, freeze it, or monitor it to trouble you, then the problem is that you really don't have your money available to you when you need it. And that is where I think gold becomes an extremely important part of your portfolio.
Many people argue that gold is cumbersome. Silver is even more cumbersome. There's a lot of Bitcoiners, for instance, who compare gold to an ancient relic or a pet rock, for instance. I think that that is a misinformed interpretation of kind of the history of finance. However, do you believe that there is a path forward wherein in local communities, gold and silver could substitute for paper currency and people could trade in gold and silver?
I don't think, Justin, I don't see a future in which gold will become a part of the currency system. But what I do see is that it's a very good way to preserve your wealth. Now, I fully agree that some people see gold as an ancient relic. And I wish that were the case. We should have evolved from gold to something more complex, something more useful to the society. But remember, for the first time in the history of humanity, we don't have gold, silver, zinc, aluminum as metals backing the monetary value of the currencies we are using. What we have for the first time in humanity is paper, which is worse than toilet paper because it does not have the characteristics of a toilet paper of absorption, which basically means that we have a worse monetary system than what cavemen had. Cavemen traded in real commodities. They had real exchanges taking place. We exchange paper or digital numbers for something real, which is so unnatural, and this will implode by itself at some point of time. In fact, it has already imploded. Most currencies have fallen by 95 to 99% of their values in the last 100 years. So they have already imploded. And this implosion is just slow. And I think it will pick up pace over the next few years, because I am currently in the US, in San Francisco. There's now a new COVID tax on restaurant bills. They add 5% to your restaurant bill. And everything, I think, is 15 to 20% more expensive. So fiat currencies are collapsing. Although the rich people might not feel it that way because they are very rich. They don't really care whether the restaurant bill is $100 or $150, but there is a huge amount of inflation, and the fiat currencies are an extremely, extremely risky part of your portfolio, and they are offering you a negative return anyway because the interest rate is negative in real terms. So what else do? You have to invest in something solid. My suggestion is that people should be keeping a lot of their wealth in East Asia, because East Asia continues to be a resilient part of the world. And gold, of course, is one of the very important part of your portfolio.
We see obviously inflation, particularly creeping into the food realm. Costco just once more put limits on certain products, paper products. I'm also seeing shortages at local grocery stores of common goods like eggs, meat, spring water. And I think Americans are in some ways getting their first taste of sort of if you want, you can call it supply chain hiccups or inflation and food shortages. We're moving from a selection-based economy in the US very clearly to a availability-based economy. And the implications thereof are dramatic. And I think that your average, I'll call them your good Americans out there who really just don't question things and go along with the program, have not fathomed what could be around the corner and what effect that will have on their daily lives. Their daily lives have been disrupted so much already in the last year and a half with COVID lockdowns. The IMF dubbed Great Lockdown. Of course, you know, the average Joe talks about the pandemic or COVID-19, but I think that there's a different level of reality in which this is just a lockdown. It's the Great Lockdown. So I'm curious, could you speak to inflation, the effects of inflation on everyday life, and bear witness to what you're seeing in San Francisco, which I think is kind of in some ways a epicenter of a new system we're seeing reveal itself?
So you mentioned, Justin, about the supply issues to do with eggs and milk. Now, the funny thing is that I talk with a lot of mining companies, and a lot of them tell me that they have a serious problem with supplies of spares. Now, imagine that if spares, the bearings and the cogs are not available in the market, the belts are not available in the market, the electric motors are not available in the market, the switches are not available in the market, these machines stop working. And that is not just a problem with the mining industry, that's a problem with all manufacturing system of the world. So there's a massive supply problem, supply chain problem. And then they also tell me that it's becoming extremely difficult to find workers. Now, workers have become difficult to find because, firstly, we are giving too much of easy money to a lot of people who then just want to spend their time in pleasurable activities with free money that they get. But also, we have restricted movement of people around the world. So, for example, a person from eastern part of Australia probably cannot go to western part of Australia. So if the capabilities, the skills are in the eastern part of Australia and what you need them for is in the western part of Australia, you can't really fly them to where they are needed. So they stay jobless and your machines can't operate because you don't have the maintenance people. So we have created this massive issue with supply chain to do with spares and to do with skills. And then you have created a massive amount of printing of paper currency, the actually digital currencies these days. And that has resulted into a massive amount of inflation. Now, what is happening, Justin, in a place like San Francisco is that a lot of these people work from home. They actually have more cash now than they used to have earlier. The reason is that they saved a lot of money in the last 1.5 years. they continued to get their full salaries, and they did not have to commute to their offices, which means that they saved on gas expenses, and they had basically more time. So they love these COVID restrictions, and in at least the the Bay Area part of California, or at least this is what I've seen. Now they have fallen for everything that the government tells them to do. I can go to a gym and there might be just a single person in the gym, and that person is fully geared up with high-tech masks. Makes absolutely no sense. Now I'm ambivalent about the mask, but why put it on when there's no one around you? Why should you be driving in your own car by yourself with the mask on? But that's the kind of extreme utopian view at least some people have in the coastal part of California. And you can also see that in their voting pattern. They tend to vote for a nanny government. They want to vote for people who tell them how to live. These people might be earning millions of dollars a year. They might have fabulous quality of life in material terms, but they do not seem to think for themselves. They are nice people, very nice people to have a drink with, and have some fun talk about small talk, basically, but you don't want to have a conversation with them about ideas because they are not interested in challenging ideas.
Small talk, probably these days centering on the San Francisco Giants, who are in first place against all odds. But that's a topic that I think is decreasingly important as we move forward into the 2020s. Yesterday, maybe we could sit around and watch sports and have a beer and talk about small things. However, I think those of us who have a sense of something more than ourselves, a sense of even maybe a higher power, are gravely concerned with developments in places like Australia, which you mentioned. Someone in forget someone in Eastern Australia being able to move to Western Australia. In some cases, in places like Melbourne, the citizens are not able to go outside for more than 2 hours a day. They're not able to move outside of a 5-kilometer radius. Furthermore, the children there are having to pick 2 friends that are on their COVID checklist that they can hang out with, but they're not allowed to change friends. Those are the only people they're allowed to hang out with. If you're going to go have a picnic in Melbourne, you can only do so with vaccinated people. And we are seeing essentially a once free nation being turned into a very ugly authoritarian system. And I mean, in North Korea, at least they say when the sun is setting that was brought to you by Kim Jong-un. In Australia, they're telling you not to look at the sunset. So can you tell us about this development in Australia? What do you think the implications are for the Australians, particularly the ones who are protesting for freedom currently, and the implications for the West generally?
Justin, what I see, at least in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, is that, again, people are extremely nice. If I go there as a tourist, or if I go and live and work in those places, they're fabulous places. Services are great. The quality of life is wonderful. But we have to remember that fundamentally, civilization does not exist in nature. Prosperity does not exist in nature. You have to create institutions. It's a lot of hard work to create institutions. And we are left with institutions that our forefathers, forefathers of the Western people, left behind 100 or 200 years back. The philosophy and the way of thinking that they left behind thousands of years back. Now, what we see today is that, and at least that I see in these 3 countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, is that people have become very lifestyle oriented. They have become extremely comfortable. And I'm very comfortable. Usually people have a nice apartment, or a nice house. They have nice kitchens. They have nice couches. They have a big screen television, a nice car. So what they worry so much about is to make sure that their quality of life stays in place. They don't want to say anything that challenges the status quo. They don't want to say anything politically incorrect that can get them to lose their jobs or lose their friends and family. So they are very fearful about any challenges that they probably should be putting forth in the society to maintain the institutions, to maintain our culture, and to maintain the culture of freedom. Now, freedom does not exist in nature. You have to keep fighting for it. As Thomas Jefferson said, to maintain liberty, you have to flow some blood. Without that, it's not possible. Now, honorable people are honorable because they are prepared to fight when the time comes. These nice, tolerant, compassionate people, which are good values by themselves, but these are low quality values. They are not the people who will honorably fight when the time comes. And that is really a big problem with at least these three countries, and through an extension to the larger Western society. They have become too comfortable. The leaders are elected by bread and circuses craving masses. And as a result, you have an anti-meritocratic system in the institutions, people who are running those institutions. And people have become so comfortable that there are not enough of people, the critical mass of people, who would fight to correct the course of degradation of the Western society. And this has been going on for decades now. So unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic about the future of the Western society.
I'm looking at Australia, and when we look back to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it was a really clear-cut example of what's been termed global governance, and that one might define as government through alliances of once sovereign nations who now are perhaps acting in concert. So we saw the global governance leading into the COVID-19 pandemic, and perhaps that was actually a ingratiation of this global governance system as the WHO directed nations across the world on health policy. And in fact, I think that you probably had World Bank and IMF offering money to lessen the impact of the COVID-19 great lockdown, as the IMF termed it once again, in exchange for them implementing certain health policies. This is the policy that we saw the World Bank and the IMF do across the quote unquote developing world, which apparently we're not going to get around to developing anymore. And in order to get loans from the World Bank or the IMF, you had to implement austerity, economic medicine, etc. And now I think these banks are the World Bank and the IMF are asking that these nations also implement certain health policies. I think what we're seeing in Australia is not perhaps domestic politicians making policy, but rather foreign entities making policies for Australia. Now, why is Australia getting it so bad? As I mentioned, you can't leave 5 kilometers from your home. You can't be out for more than 2 hours a day. This is hardcore. Now, why? I think it's because perhaps they're on an island and these people can't go anywhere, and it serves as perhaps a beta test for the rest of the Western world. Any thoughts on that?
Well, Justin, I think our leaders have become truly simplistic, and the masses are just interested in resources and materialism. If you might recall, and if you have seen that, the mayor of New York made an advertisement with himself posing, eating a burger and fries. And he said that anyone who gets the vaccine would get a coupon to get free fries. Now, have the society become so degraded that a piece of a bag of French fries would entice you into getting the vaccine? Now, I have nothing against the vaccine. If you think it's the legitimate thing to do, the right thing to do, take it. But should you be offered such a petty bribe to take the vaccine? So many people in democracy are voters who have no more interest in life than their French fries and burgers and the TV screen. And they are the people who elect and enable very simplistic bureaucrats and government politicians to rule us. And that is where we see these simplistic policies about world government, the reset, the great reset, where Justin Trudeau of Canada repeats quite often. And a lot of simplistic people, simplistic, naive people who are nice, shining clogs, including in San Francisco, think that that is the way the world should work. Universe is extraordinarily complex. It does not work in a simplistic, linear fashion. And they don't really understand the secondary and third order complications they create through their simplistic devices. Now, for example, over the last 10, 20 years, governments around the world, at least the US, has implemented this factor. Now, FATCA means that your banks are required to report all accounts to IRAS, the revenue services of the United States. Now, the problem is that it became such a complicated issue that banks simply don't accept American clients, banks which are outside the US. Now, so a simple thing becomes extremely complex because these people are too naive and simplistic. These rulers are too naive and simplistic. They cannot understand the higher order effect. And what we see today is that everything is getting centralized because these naive people think that centralization is a way to run the society more efficiently. It isn't. It creates over centralization, and it creates systemic risks because it centers all responsibility on fewer and fewer entities. And when things go wrong, it will just fall apart. The world will fall apart very rapidly. So we cannot engineer a society. We cannot make a society work like a machine, because even in a machine, a cog breaks, the whole machine breaks down. And that is the kind of society they are creating. It will run well as long as it runs well, but then the supply chain issues will come up. One small thing will fall apart, and the whole society around the world will fall apart. And that is clearly going to happen, but these simplistic, naive people who rule us don't really understand it.
I would say that as we see vaccine data coming in, it is implying that perhaps the vaccine is best case scenario ineffective or worse. But I want to leave that for a conversation maybe another time, especially as increasingly the data comes back. But with this kind of move away from these concepts of liberty and freedom in the West towards maybe a sense of responsibility to a collective, having overtaken that collectivism, what do people need to know about the importance of these concepts to civilization and how they can help foster a meritocracy? And without these values of, freedom, liberty, equality, pursuit of happiness, as well as meritocracy, morals and ethics, what might we expect as the Western world unravels over the next 10 to 25 years?
Well, I don't think the Western world has 10 to 25 years left in it. The Western world is degrading at a faster pace as time goes by. Who could have imagined that Australians would let go of their liberties so quickly? And, I know you mentioned about massive protests happening in parts of Australia, but that is only a very small minority of Australians who are protesting. Most Australians who write back to me say that they are very happy with the strong measures the government has taken, and they want a nanny government. So the end result is that they will get more and more of a nanny government as time goes by. And that is exactly what's happening in the Western world. And this will not end very well. I grew up in a nanny government society. I grew up in what I would say a woke society, a socialist hellhole. And I know the consequences of all this. A tsunami is building up, and we see calm sea right now, but this tsunami will hit us very quickly. It could hit tomorrow morning, or it could hit 6 months from now, but it will hit us sooner rather than later in the Western world, because of one big problem that we have elected people like Justin Trudeau, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden as our leaders. I really wonder, Justin, who were the people who went to the voting booth to vote for these really idiotic, simplistic, linear thinking, corrupt psychopaths? But that's what you end up with the masses who are only interested in resources and free French fries are allowed to vote. Democracy has been an unmitigated disaster for the Western world and certainly for the third world countries. Do Canadian women really think they should be voting for the looks of Justin Trudeau? That's hilarious.
I imagine we see the same thing in California with Gavin Newsom, quite the looker. And, I saw bumper stickers in San Diego while I was still living there of my governor is hotter than your governor. Talk about vapid. And of course, the woman who has this bumper sticker, it weighs 300 pounds. That aside, I'm looking at, let's see, I'm curious, you mentioned your experience around the world in India, for instance. Could you speak a little bit more to that and kind of where you see where you see the West heading?
Justin, just to give you my background, I have been traveling around the world for the last 30 years. I have, except for the last 1.5 years, I have been to almost 4 or 5, 6 countries every year. I'm out of every country in about a month's time. I've been to about 100 countries, most of them several times in these 30 years. And even in the last 1.5 years, I have spent a lot of time traveling, but limited to Mexico, the United States, and India, because these 3 countries don't force me into a quarantine room. The third world countries are falling apart. You see the third world countries falling apart in Latin America. You see them falling apart in Africa. You see countries like India and Pakistan and Afghanistan and the Arab world falling apart. And there are 2 reasons behind it. One is that these people whatever stability that they had it because there was a fear of America. There was the whip of America that was prepared to be unleashed on the tyrants and dictators of these third world countries in case they went beyond a certain limit. Now, America is far weaker now. People don't even respect America now because of this emerging woke culture. Third world countries will fall apart. Latin America will become increasingly socialist and communist, and I would say even woke. And woke is a feral, is completely feral way of thinking, where you don't, communists wanted you to work. Communists did not give you free money. They forced you to work. They sent you to Gulag to work. Woke people don't do anything. They just want the rivers of money, milk and honey to run forever. They don't have a clue where milk and honey comes from. So the third world will fall apart, and the Western world will face horrendous consequences, because the underpinning values, the Western values, the religion, Christianity, has been mostly removed from the underpinnings of the Western society. Now, the pillars and the palace is still there because the foundations allowed that palace to have structurally be very good. So you still have the institutions, you still have a certain way of conduct. Even the leftists in the West are very polite and tolerant and compassionate people. But the problem is that when the underpinning philosophical aspects are gone, eventually the structure will crumble, will have cracks and will fall apart. And that is what you clearly see in the Western world. And this is picking up pace because we lack the moral foundations. I mean, 20 years back when I started, 20, 30 years back when I started coming to the West, people were honorable enough not to ask for free money. Now they ask for free money from the government as a God-given right. That is how degraded the society has become, or at least certain sections of the society have become, which are also the majority of the voting population. So again, without the philosophical underpinnings, the palace will collapse eventually. All this prosperity that you and I enjoy will disappear without that philosophical base. As I said earlier, civilization does not exist in nature. Prosperity does not exist in nature. You have to fight for it. Pacifist, tolerant, compassionate people cannot build a civilization. They are fine people by themselves, but you have to have warrior mentality, the values of honor and integrity, the acceptance of suffering. If you have to suffer to get the right things done, which we increasingly lack in the Western society. And that is what's going to create a huge problem in the West.
I'm curious to hear more about the warrior mentality. And it's very clear that Christian values led to some of the best experiments in history: the US, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. These are grounded very much in Christian faith. Could you speak to the importance of Christianity in a really godless world in many ways? As Nietzsche said so many centuries ago, God is dead. And that's kind of like waved as a good thing nowadays. But, I'm not so sure that that's what Nietzsche meant by that notion. So could you speak more to the importance of Christianity, morals and values, especially in the context of the warrior mentality?
Well, yeah. So what I have seen is that people who becomes non-religious, who become atheist, also become extremely materialistic. They become extremely lifestyle oriented, because without religion, without a set, they somehow the moral values don't stick in them. Now, it does not mean that they are bad people in the day-to-day life, but they don't really have this passion for something larger than themselves. They care about their kitchen cutting board, for example, or the kitchen platform more than they care about the larger things in life. And without the larger things driving us, we cannot be creative, we cannot be passionate, we would not accept suffering for a greater cause, we will not accept suffering for what would be beneficial for us in the long term. We might not want to have children, we might not want to have a committed relationship, we might not want to commit to something that over a period of time bring us results. So without religion, I think people have become very materialistic and short-term oriented. Now, I don't want people to have a dogmatic religion, but somehow religion imbued into the Western society a sense of greater purpose, a feeling for the brotherhood of their own community. And that seems to not exist among the atheist secular people that I come across, let's say in San Francisco. At the same time, I have to say that my big interest is in Christianity as it exists in the Western society. There are many other religions which are pagan to fanatic to be extremely dogmatic, but Christianity in the Western society enabled reason, rationality, moral values, honor, to be a part of the society rather than not be a part of the society.
I see atheism, which I'm very familiar with because I was raised essentially with that as a very dominant strain of popular culture when I was younger, as essentially like the state religion. It's a blank slate upon which anything can be written. I think historically, those more dogmatic religious organizations in many cases were organs of the king, God, or the king and queen, or the state. And now, atheism, it's like essentially a blank slate upon which anything can be written. What is it? And it literally means like you're not theistic. So you're going to define yourself by that which you are. It's a half-baked philosophy in which those who remain atheists didn't fully think through the logical conclusion that maybe they're not atheists, maybe they're naturalists. Maybe they believe nature governs everything. Or perhaps then from there, they might also conclude that like nature is God and God is nature, to kind of get a little bit, whimsical, if you will. However, atheism is like a checkpoint on the way to some other philosophy. And it seems like no one goes any further. And so the state can just essentially, come in and fill the void. And that's why you have people who are interested in the nanny state, and they believe that the government's going to come in and make things good or better or more fair or equal, when that is actually a fundamental delusion that maybe they learned in high school, public school, the government school, from Houghton Mifflin, which portrays a very simplistic view of history. I'm curious, do you have any comments on that? But also, do you have any comments on the populist movements we've seen in countries like Brazil, and then also in the US with Trump, who had had a massive amount of supporters? A lot of people might write all those supporters off as like racists or white supremacists. However, that's a delusion. It's an oversimplistic way of looking at it. There's a reason why Donald Trump resonated with the American public, and still does, really. I mean, he is kind of the flag bearer of the Republican Party. He is also the likely candidate for the Republican Party in 2024. I did some research back in January 2016, and I concluded that he had a very legitimate shot at winning the presidency in November of that year, about 11 months later. I also found that I thought Bernie Sanders was leading the Democratic nominee at that point. However, of course, the DNC kind of stripped him of that even though he would have put up a better fight than Hillary Clinton did because people liked him more, especially young people. And then Trump too. It was very clear to me early on that this guy was the leading candidate. And when he was elected, I really was unmoved. I thought, let's see how this goes. My main concern at that point was all these wars that we kept starting over the course of my life. In 2003, when we invaded Iraq, I was 14 years old, and that was kind of a disaster. There probably could have been cleaner ways of managing that. And then, of course, we've invaded many countries under Bush and Obama during that time. So that's kind of where I'm looking at Donald Trump. I'm like, let's see, does he start a new war? Well, he doesn't. So therefore I vote for him. It's really the first president I ever voted for, actually, other than Ron Paul. I try to look at him from a rational perspective, and he's, in my opinion, far better than the presidents that I experienced growing up. And I think I could go on and on about why. However, of course, as a, Jewish, Mexican, white supremacist, I would think that after all, right? But could you speak more to the populist movements that are spreading across the globe, especially from the context of Trump and then Bolsonaro, and maybe even Hungary? I think there's something a brew.
Well, there's something very special about the United States, Justin, and I love this country. I spend about 4 to 5 months a year in the United States. And over the last 1.5 years, I have learned to have a hugely more appreciation for this country. The US has been the only Western country that has allowed people to fly in and fly out of this country without being quarantined or without being troubled in these COVID days. I have been to the US 5 or 6 times in the last 1 year. There is something very special about the American spirit, particularly of the kind of people who voted for Trump. If I had the right to vote in the US, I would have very happily gone to vote for Trump. And that would have gone against my philosophy as a libertarian, but I would have very happily gone to vote for him because he not only awakened the people about this wokeness that was emerging in the Western world, which was probably his biggest contribution. He talked about the swamp in Washington. No politicians in the past of that caliber had the courage to challenge the bureaucracy that runs the world today. So Trump did a lot of good things. Now, is he racist? Hey, no, business people are usually not racist. You can't run a mega business like that by being racist, particularly in the construction business when you have to employ a lot of non-European people, particularly Hispanics, because some of them are actually legal, or some of them are the kind of people who are happy to work to get elevated in life. No, so there is not a chance that Trump is a racist. Would I want him to win again? Of course, I want him to win again. And clearly, there is a large part of the US that is extremely conservative, which is what I favor, has patriotic views. Now, I actually spend as much time as I can in those places, and I don't find them racist at all. The biggest racist people are the leftists and the woke people who think that people of color are incapable of standing on their own feet and need a nanny government as crutches to stand up. The most sexist people are the people who think women are incapable of rising up in power and must be forced to be promoted out of turn in companies and in government positions. So no, instinctively, the real racists are the leftists and the woke people, and particularly the woke people, the most degraded part of the Western society, not the conservatives. And I love the conservative people. They are respectful. They are perfectly fine. I feel safe among them.
I think Malcolm X echoed that sentiment about the white liberal in the US. I'm curious, do you have any other comments on the populism that we're seeing across the world and hopes for that populism? And then also, why is nationalism important? I'll argue that it's a form of decentralization away from decentralizing powers. And therefore, it actually creates more opportunity, more freedom, more prosperity when we have diversity of opinion, of peoples, people can choose where to live based on the culture there. Whereas we move towards this more monolithic system, that choice will be kind of stripped from the people. And nationalism is one way to guard against that. So any thoughts about populism and hopes for the populism that we're seeing today?
But yeah, the populism that we have is something very unique to the Western world. And I don't think the world has ever seen this kind of populism before. This is what we call the woke culture. And these are the people who have had an extremely good life. They have all food that they want to eat. They have all the Pepsi Colas, all the chips, and all the alcohol. They have all the drugs that they want to consume available to them, seem to be disadvantaged, but they have nothing to do with the Marxists or communists, people of the past who were in certain ways exploited. There was a lot of poverty and hunger. When you have poverty and hunger, I can understand that people have no choice but to become extremely frustrated. But these people, the woke people, have no purpose in life. They have been provided all the comforts of life. So they are violent. They go around breaking shops, what they have done in Portland or Seattle, for example. These people are just spoiled brats who have no purpose in life, no vision of life. And this populism is the worst kind of populism you can expect. This is a feral, wild, just jungle-like populism. They have no values. Communists and Marxists had certain values. These people, woke people, have no values whatsoever. These are feral people. And unfortunately, we have given acceptance to their to these people, and they are gaining political power as time has gone by. Look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the other really, truly stupid women who make absolutely no sense, gaining increasing power, and including unfortunately, the president and vice president of the United States today. Look at Justin Trudeau when he was asked why you have 50% of his cabinet as women. His response was that cabinet had to reflect the underlying ethnicities of the country, as if ethnicity is all that matters, not meritocracy. And look at the Afghani woman, the Afghani refugees women, who is the minister in the federal government, who calls Taliban her brothers. Now, that's the kind of valueless, dishonorable people that we increasingly have in the Western society. This populism looks good to naive, simplistic people. It is good for virtue signaling purposes. But as I said, compassion and tolerance is all virtue signaling if it's not also supported by honor and integrity. And unfortunately, that's what we have in this populism. And this populism has become increasingly popular and is gaining increasing popularity as time goes by.
And we see increasingly too that popular talk shows and news shows, which kind of the line between which is blurred, are cautioning people against doing your own research, and particularly cautioning people against those who do their own research. It's almost like DYOR, which is kind of the short net speak for do your own research, is like kind of being positioned as like some white supremacist like catcall or something, which is totally absurd. Now, as my last question, I'm curious, there is this childish gold versus Bitcoin debate that takes place in the gold industry as well as in the Bitcoin industry. I don't think this is an either or proposition. I think these are different commodities which serve different purposes and have different kind of value based on kind of completely different factors. Now, where do you stand on the gold versus Bitcoin debate?
Well, I clearly favor the gold issue when it comes to gold and Bitcoin. I take a position opposite to yours when it comes to Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is zeros and ones, and it has no inherent value. And it must eventually go back to zero. Now, that does not mean I'm 100% correct on this. It just means that that's what I think as I stand today about my understanding of cryptocurrencies. And I feel far more confident about real substances like gold and copper. So I prefer to invest in something that I'm reasonably sure of, rather than of something that I have either not enough understanding of, or which I think has no value.
So my take on Bitcoin is that the values behind it and the ideas behind it are extremely powerful. And we see that still today at Bitcoin 2021 and back in, I guess it was June of this year. There was 12,000 people there. Many of them were of the libertarian conservative persuasion, which means that it has really, in many ways, kept the same attention that it had back in 08, 09 to 2012, before it had real mainstream press attention. That is, those libertarian conservative values are still there backing Bitcoin. However, I think that Bitcoin, while it might be a hedge against inflation, it certainly is not the what I call ultimate safe haven that gold is. Gold is the safe haven of last resort. Bitcoin is not that. As Klaus Schwab, who runs the World Economic Forum, has said, that he expects some sort of cyber attack to kind of paralyze our systems. In such an event, while you might still be able to hold your Bitcoin, the fact that you can't reasonably send them to other parties unless you absolutely trust those other parties, that you're actually sending this Bitcoin transaction online, and then once the internet comes back up, then it's going to be completed, is like not a good situation to be in. And that's where I think something like gold as the safe haven of last resort, and silver, safe haven of last resort, comes in. That's why I see these things as two completely different commodities. They are not anywhere, they're totally different. And I think that the Bitcoiners who are thinking in terms of a safe haven of last resort in the event of a black swan event, which Palantir did with their $100 million gold purchase in the event of a black swan event, they're naive. The Bitcoiners are naive. The gold bugs, many of them probably should not come anywhere near Bitcoin, because they might not have the technical skills to hold the Bitcoin themselves. And then they will be holding it on Coinbase, for instance, which then I guess flies in the face of everything they want in an asset, or I'm sorry, a commodity. Period. So any kind of closing thoughts on any of that?
Well, I would close my thoughts on something that I did not complete earlier. We were talking about racism of the so-called racism of Trump. And we were talking about white supremacism that apparently exists in the mind of so many people. Now, I have been living in the Western society for the last 30 years, and just about every person of color I have ever had an intimate talk with says exactly the same thing, that people of European ethnicities are the least racist people. And it actually becomes more and more racist the more the people who talk about who complain about white supremacy are exactly the people who are usually the most racist. Ask people of color, ask women what their preferences are when it comes to working with people, and on an intimate basis, they might tell you that they will tell you very likely that people of European ethnicities are the least racist people. And that's what certainly my experience has been.
We see that Hispanics and Blacks came out and voted for Trump. And I think that to dismiss those people as maybe just kind of being like having a slave mentality or like bowing down to like some colonial masters is racist. It's racist.
Yeah. I look at people based on the merit and the values that those people have, rather than on the color of their skin. I mean, when you think so much about the sex and color of the people you're talking about, it is you who is bigoted, not the other person.
We've had the honor of sitting down today with Jayant Bhandari. He's a writer and an advisor of institutional investors, and you can find his work at jayantbhandari.com, correct?
That's correct, Justin.
Thank you so much, Jayant, for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. What's up, everyone? I hope you enjoyed the show. Head on over to GoldSilverBitcoin.com for more content like this, as well as long-form written articles about precious metals, Bitcoin, and other topics. Also, check out our shop where you can get precious metals, storable foods, and all sorts of other cool survival and prep gear as well.